Welcome to episode 160 of On Record PR. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into strategies and insights that matter most to law firm leaders, as we do every week. I'm Gina Rubel, CEO and General Counsel of Fury Rubel Communications, and I'm joined by my colleague and co-host, Jennifer Simpson Carr. Hi, Jen.
Hi, Gina. Hi, everyone. It's Monday, January 13th. Gina and I were actually supposed to be in Los Angeles for business this week. And so, as not to already overburden or add to an overburdened infrastructure, we've deferred our trip. Our hearts go out to everyone that's impacted by the fires. It's been devastating to watch from afar. And, we're just thinking about everyone who's impacted.
Jen, we have clients, law firms who have partners who have lost their homes. So it's really a time for us to be helpful, not to, as you said, add more burden. So thank you for going along with me.
Of course. So we're 1 week away from the United States presidential inauguration, which has been top of mind for many law firm leaders. Last week, the Wall Street Journal actually published an article, Law Firms Pivot for Trump's Return. It's no secret that the role of law firm leaders has expanded in recent years, and it goes beyond what their traditional responsibilities have been, running the firm, nurturing client relationships. Now, leaders are expected to act as public commentators on many global issues, including politics, social injustices. It's an area where we've been guiding clients for many years, but an area that's exponentially increased since 2020. So today we're going to dive into the critical topic of how law firm leaders should respond to the growing expectation to comment publicly on political and social issues. Gina, this is an area you've been speaking on extensively for the past several years, and most specifically to chiefs and leadership like managing partners, COOs, CMOs, really the decision makers at these firms. What do you find to be the most common reaction?
Jennifer, what's interesting is last year I spoke at the Thomson Reuters conference it was all managing partners. And what I heard over and over and over again is I didn't sign up for this. So, in other words, I didn't sign up for a pandemic. I didn't sign up for, um, crazy political issues here in the U.S. I didn't sign up for riots in my backyard. I didn't sign up for people to be murdered. And so these decisions to speak out on things are daunting because they can have a significant impact on the firm, on its reputation, the clients, the lawyers, the professional staff. I mean, in fact, just this morning, there's an article in American Lawyer Media on law.com about whether or not Elon Musk can bring down a firm with one post on his platform X, formerly known as Twitter. And that's pretty darn scary. I mean, think about that. If he can post one thing, let's say it's one of the firms that sued him or represented an adversary, and it could be an AmLaw 10 firm, which is mentioned in the article, and he can try to bring them down just by using a single platform.
Yeah,
So the decision, go ahead, I'm sorry.
no, the impact is far reaching, certainly. And
hmm
and I cut you off. You said the decision.
Whether or not to speak up and what should be said needs to be considered in a very thoughtful way. It's not a scattershot approach. And smaller firms in particular are used to just, managing partner makes a decision and goes out, but there's no framework around it. There's no way to make that decision. And bigger firms, they tend to be much more organized and run more like corporations, and they make decisions in a very strategic way. But that I know we're going to be talking about. So,
Yeah, so
um,
listeners might be thinking, okay, so I don't get calls from the media, but really we're not just speaking about the media. I mean, who are you finding are the stakeholders or the groups of people or individuals that are expecting law firm leaders to speak out on these types of issues?
a great question. And interestingly, it could be anybody. So think about when Hamas invaded Israel. And it was really predominantly people, it started out predominantly being people of Jewish origin or Jewish faith and saying we need to speak up on this. And then it may be somebody who is pro-Palestinian, and then they say, well, the firm needs to speak up on this. Or when Russia invaded Ukraine, it could be clients saying, well, we have business interests in Russia and we need to keep business interests in Russia. You need to speak out on this. Or affirmative action decisions. It may have been some of the groups that were more protected through affirmative action, or the Dobbs decision. It's going to be women. So it doesn't matter who those women are, if they're clients, if they're staff. So every situation, and what's interesting is, and I'll talk more about this, but even think back to when George Floyd was murdered. There were a lot of law firms. I recall Honigman being one of them that spoke out, and they spoke out very prolifically, and it made a difference. And they're up in Detroit, so they needed to. They're in an area that's affected, and so and they had others speak out with them in that market, but it was not something that was done with a scattershot approach.
So I've heard you mention a number of different stakeholders, potentially clients, uh, employees, staff, professional staff, lawyers. So there's a lot of dynamics there, and those views and perspectives may not always be aligned. So you mentioned a few, but what are some other examples of political and social issues that law firm leaders need to be thinking about that all of these different parties may have an expectation that they would be speaking on?
Anything. If you go back, and I was just thinking, Jen, back when Israel was invaded, I got a call from a reporter from a national legal outlet saying, why aren't law firms speaking out? And my response was, because they very likely may have offices there, people there who are at risk, and it's a live hostage situation. It's not time for law firms to speak out publicly. It was time for them to be speaking internally. So it's I think to answer your question, it's any situation. It can be local and regional, or it can be national or global. And it really depends. And it's so important that firms are prepared with some type of strategy, protocol, a way to address what's happening. Because we don't, do you remember what I said before the pandemic? Do you remember I said that there's not a crisis I haven't dealt with?
Yes. Yeah. Yep.
Right? And then the pandemic hit, right? And I'm like, oh, I haven't dealt with a pandemic, but now we have protocols in place to deal with the pandemic. Or so if the avian flu spreads in the United States, we're well prepared for how we're going to manage that. Um, but we don't know what's coming. We don't know the next step. I mean, strategically, law firms need to be prepared well in advance to make statements internally and externally, and they don't always have to be external. They do always have to be internal. And that doesn't mean that everything that's internal doesn't go outside. We know that. But that comes in the form of incident response plans. Most people know them as crisis response, but I like to be careful about the word crisis because not everything is a crisis. Sometimes it's just an incident.
Mhm.
And, I'll actually be speaking on this entire topic at the ABA conference in Phoenix at the end of this month. So it's January 2025 for those who didn't hear the beginning. Um, and I'll be speaking to the National Conference of Bar Presidents on this very topic.
That's interesting. It's not just law firm leaders, it's really any leadership in the legal or business space. And something you mentioned that about internal communications being written, because is a way that they would be shared externally is something that you and our EVP, Sarah Larson, has really embedded in me, which is all communications, internal, external, all have to be written in a way that potentially will be viewed by somebody externally. So uh, let's pause here for a message from our sponsor and we get back. I'd like to talk to you about what law firm leaders can do to prepare themselves for the inevitable questions that they'll receive around these topics.
Absolutely.
This episode is brought to you by Furia Rubel Communications, a public relations and marketing agency serving law firms and businesses worldwide. With an expert team positioned throughout the U.S. and supported by an international faculty, Furia Rubel enhances our clients' brands through integrated communications by providing expert guidance in crisis management and high-profile litigation, protecting brand and reputation, and supporting internal marketing teams. To learn more, visit furiarubel.com.
So, Gina, we're back from our sponsor break, and to pick up on what we were talking about, how can law firm leaders prepare for these inevitable situations where they're asked by any stakeholders, a client, a member of the media, their colleagues, to take a position and speak up on any of these political or social topics?
So, Jen, before the break, I mentioned that they need incident response plans, and those plans need to have policies and protocols regarding what they should be speaking up about, why they're speaking up, who should be speaking up, and how they speak up. And, you know, in very recent months, some of the big universities, some of the Ivies came out and said, we will only speak up about issues that directly affect education. It's because they were starting to get overtaxed by the media and asked to speak up on everything. And those types of policies and protocols are a must before even thinking about speaking publicly. And so many firms don't have them.
So, for firms that don't have a policy or protocol in place, what do you recommend as a first step?
So the first step is actually to put a policy in place and what those protocols are. And then the second part, that's a two-part answer. And then there's having a framework with which to work from, which, as you know, we've created. That's what we're going to talk about for the rest of the podcast, is having a framework to decide, is this something we should be speaking up about and why? So it's not just the policy of who can speak when and how, like who can be a spokesperson, who can bind the firm or your organization, like a bar association. But then how do we decide what to say? So there's a whole structure for that.
So, can you run us
So
through what those key considerations are for law firm leaders?
absolutely. So there's a 12-step framework that we've created at Furia Rubel, and it's what we use. So the first step is to, what's your goal? What do we want to do? And so as a firm, it may be, we want to make sure that all of our lawyers know that we still believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion, no matter what ruling just came down from the Supreme Court. And I don't want to make this a political podcast. What it's just understanding that, what is our goal? Do we want to be seen as an inclusive law firm? Then it's, who is our audience? And really breaking it down, like, who does this matter to? Does it only matter to people internally, or does this, whatever issue you're facing, matter to people internally and externally? Looking to see if you have any conflicts. Interestingly enough, there's what we know as true legal, like real conflicts, like conflicts as you would find as they relate to the model rules of professional conduct, or your state's rules of professional conduct, or your country's rules of professional conduct, depending on where you're listening from. But then there's other types of conflicts, like, and I'm not going to name the client, but we have a client in a particular jurisdiction that they have a very big presence in a large city in the United States. And the governor there is I'm being careful. The governor there is relatively unseemly. However, this client represents a lot of state entities. They have to be very careful on what they speak out about that relates to the governor because they represent a lot of state entities. And so there would be a perceived conflict, even if they disagree with something like some mandate that the governor is coming down with. They have to be extremely careful because of a very large portion of their business is state related. So that's a perceived conflict. And where that goes even further is if you have members in your firm who are leaders in the local bar association, and let's say the bar association wants to speak out about that. Let's say that perhaps you have somebody who's the president of the bar association. If they have a perceived conflict, then perhaps it needs to be the vice president who speaks out. So and that's the kind of thing I'll be talking about at the ABA, but it relates the same to law firms. You really have to think about what is a real conflict and what is perceived. Does your firm have the authority or credibility? And what does that look like? And I have a list in front of me if you see me looking down, Jen, because I never remember them off the top of my head. Um, what are your intentions? Your goal may be very different than your intentions. And so a goal is to make sure perhaps clients are aware that you won't tolerate a certain type of behavior in the community, but your intention may be to really make sure that your internal stakeholders understand what resources are available internally to them. Let's say, for example, it's an issue that relates to LGBTQIA plus rights. Making sure that your internal audience knows that you have resources available to them if they're dealing with stress or other behavioral health issues as a result of whatever's happening. Um, Stakeholder considerations, consistency. Consistency is a big one. So, did we speak out on George Floyd, but then not on a very similar incident? Um, or did we not speak out about women's rights, but now we're going to speak out about men's rights or something like that? So, thinking about consistency over time, people do look at that, especially the media. And then things you said previously can very well become invalidated as performative. What are our risks in speaking up? As I mentioned earlier, uh, Elon Musk, if he tweets about your firm something negative, is there a risk to your firm losing credibility with a lot of its stakeholders? Uh, there's all sorts of risks today that are different than even a year ago. Do you have partnerships and support? When I mentioned Honigman's firm, when they spoke out about George Floyd, they partnered with a lot of other law firms. And so it was incredible the way they all came up and spoke out together. And just for full transparency, Honigman is not a client, for our listeners. It's just, I was really impressed with how they handled that. What are our communication strategy? Strategy is super important. Are we going to message internally first, then externally? How, when, why, what platforms? And then finally, how are we going to monitor and evaluate? Not only monitor the feedback, but evaluate our performance as a firm. So if we spoke out on X, what does that mean? Why does it matter? And what are we going to continue to do so that it doesn't become a performative statement? So that's the 12-step framework in a nutshell. I usually present on this in over an hour in a discussion, Jen, but that's the framework for purposes of this podcast.
That's incredibly helpful. I know that it's received a lot of great feedback. And what I want to do is encourage our listeners as a next step after, the episode ends is to download this 12-step framework that Gina's created. If you don't have a policy or framework at your firm, it's a fantastic starting point. It can help you prepare proactively for the chance that you'll be asked to speak, and then it will help you walk through whether or not to do that. But if you already have a framework internally, you should also consider downloading the framework because I, you should consider the last time you updated it and maybe compare the questions that Gina's posed against where your firm stands now. I mean, things change so quickly now. Something that was in place even this time last year uh, may not have all the considerations as fast as technology is moving, the administration in the US is changing.
And Jen, there's something I really think leaders need to take away from this. The 12-step uh, framework really allows you to sit in an EC meeting and work through the questions strategically together as a team and make decisions strategically together as a team in the best interest of the organization and its stakeholders. And that's what it's meant to do, as opposed to having your entire EC going, oh, I think we should do this, and here's why, and I think we should do this, and here's why, and they just argue and and it becomes this full circle thing, as opposed to working through a framework that gets you from point A to point Z. And it's democratic, and I don't use that word lightly. It's collaborative. And so that's what I like about this framework is it takes the personal emotion and bias out of the decision-making process, and it allows the firm to make a decision, or the leadership of the firm to make a decision in a very strategic, organized way. And we have heard that some of our clients and friends who have used this framework have seen these meetings cut down in time because they use it, they work through it, they make a decision, they move on. And when I think about the number of billable hours in a room, think about that when they're trying to make a decision and just the wheels keep spinning and spinning and spinning and spinning. I mean, there's no value in that, right? So that's what I love about this framework is it adds to productivity, it adds to transparency. It provides a way for firms to really look at things differently than the old adage, well, this is the way we've always done it. We hear that way too often.
Well, I want to thank our listeners for tuning in today. Again, we welcome your feedback on this new podcast format. We'd love to hear topics from you that you would like to hear more about. Please email us at podcast@onrecordpr.com. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on iTunes, and we will see you next week.
Bye, everybody.
On Record PR is produced by Jennifer Simpson Carr and Matt Henderson, with support from the team at Rubel Communications. This episode is edited by Isabel Horan and Christian Yamula. Visit www.onrecordpr.com for resources and more information.